pregnant and cast out into a coyote-filled canyon. A cowboy followed the cries and gave her a roof. I heard her before I saw her. That's the thing nobody asks about when you tell them. They want to know what she looked like, or what I said, or did I know right then. But the beginning of it was just sound. In the dark, coming up out of that canyon like something tearing cloth. I'd been out checking the south fence line. One of the posts had heeled over in the wash, and I'd been meaning to get to it for 3 days. It was past 9 o'clock, no moon to speak of, cold enough that my fingers were stiff on the wire cutters. The horse, Old Drum, he went rigid first, ears straight up. That freeze he'd do, like something had reached down and grabbed him by the chest. I'd learned over 12 years to trust that freeze more than my own 2 eyes. The sound came again. Not a coyote. I'd been hearing coyotes since before I could remember the hearing of them, their yip-yap floating off the ridges, the long moan they'd wind up before a kill. This was different. This was a person, or something trying to be. I tied Drum to a cedar post and went down on foot. The canyon rim drops off fast on that south edge, old red rock shelving down in ledges before it opens into the dry creek 30 feet below. I went slow, one hand on the rock, feeling for each foothold before I put weight on it. The sound was closer now, a keening, low and pulled tight like whatever strength there was in it was running out. I found her on the 3rd ledge down. She was wedged against a juniper that had cracked out of the rock face, her back against the canyon wall, knees up and arms wrapped around herself. Young, couldn't have been more than 22. Dark hair plastered to her face. A burlap sack to one side, that was everything she had, that sack, and her dress was torn at the shoulder and her feet were wrapped in rags tied with cord. I crouched down about 6 feet from her and I didn't say a word. You don't come at a frightened thing fast. I waited until she looked up, until she'd had a chance to see what I was and wasn't. Her eyes were black in the dark. They didn't beg. That was the first thing I noticed about her that was going to matter. She didn't beg. She looked at me the way a person looks at a river crossing they're not sure about. Measuring, not pleading. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. She didn't answer right away. Then, "The coyotes have been close." "Yes," I said, "I know it." That was when I noticed she was pregnant. Far along. The way she was holding herself wasn't just cold and fear, she'd been holding herself together against something else. I said, "Can you stand?" She tried, got about halfway up, and then the canyon wall stopped her. I went to her then, and she let me, put her hand on my arm to steady herself, and I could feel how cold she was through my sleeve, like touching something that had been outside for a long time. Getting her up that ledge in the dark took longer than it should have. She was quiet through it, even when I knew it had to hurt. I'd put my hand on her back going up the steeper part, and she didn't pull away, just moved with the help and kept climbing. When we got to the top, she sat down in the dirt and breathed. I unsaddled Drum and got the bedroll off and put it around her shoulders. Drum stood close, his warm breath coming in clouds. She put her hand on his muzzle without thinking about it, the way you do with an animal you trust, and that told me something too. I said, "My place is 3 miles north. There's a fire." She looked at the dark outline of the hills, then at me. "Why?" she said. I thought about it, because 3 miles in this cold without shoes doesn't end well. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. She rode Drum and I walked. That was how we came in out of the dark. My name is Calvert Doss. I want to say that plainly, because this story deserves it, deserves to be told by someone with a name, and not just an old cowhand who happened to be fixing fence. I am 71 years old now, and I have been on this land for 43 of them, and I have buried 1 wife and 2 dogs and a horse named after Thunder. And there are mornings still when I walk out to the east pasture before sunup, and the light is coming up gold and pink behind the flats, and I think, I did not expect any of this. I did not expect her. Her name was Nessa Bryant. She told me that after she'd been in my house 3 days. Before that, she didn't tell me anything she didn't have to. I gave her the bedroom and I slept on the floor by the stove, and she took what I brought her: broth, corn bread, blankets, and said thank you in a voice that carried the habit of not asking for things. I didn't push. A person tells you what they can when they can. What I knew from the beginning, somebody had done this to her, had set her out there without shoes in the cold. The rags on her feet were her own underskirt, torn up. The bruise along her jaw she never explained and I never asked about. On the 3rd day, she came out into the main room and sat at the table, and I poured coffee and sat down across from her, and she talked. Her husband, a cattleman from over by Creston, good standing in town, money from his father, had decided in the last month of her carrying that the child was not his. She said this plainly, the way you say something you have already said to yourself 100 times and worn the emotion off of. Said she told him it was his. Said it didn't matter what she told him. Said he'd driven her out 20 miles in the wagon and left her on the canyon road with the burlap sack and nothing else, and told her she could walk to Denton and throw herself on whatever charity she could find, or she could die in the canyon, and he did not especially care which. I sat with that. She watched me sit with it, those measuring eyes. I said, the law in this county is Sheriff Alden. He's a fair man. She said, her husband has more land than the sheriff's family has had in 3 generations. I said, all right. She said, I'm not asking you for anything, Mr. Doss. I know it, I said. I'll be on my way when I'm able. Where, I asked, not unkindly, just honestly. She didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't thought she would. I said, stay until the baby comes, then we'll see what's what. She looked at her coffee, then she said, why would you do that? I thought about the question. I could have said something about the right thing, or Christian charity, or any of the ready-made answers a man has on hand for moments like that. But she was looking at me like she'd heard all those answers before, and they'd never been true, and she deserved better than the rehearsed version. I said, I've been alone out here a long time. My wife died 6 years ago. I don't need much company. But I'm used to things being cared for on this place, the horses, the dogs, the fences, the cattle. I guess I don't care to leave a person in the canyon either. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, all right, Mr. Doss. She was useful. I want to say that because it mattered to her and it mattered to me. She wasn't a burden that I carried. Inside a week she was making bread and mending and keeping the stove. And when I came in from the morning's work, there was something warm on the table. And the sound of a person moving around in a house you'd gotten used to being empty is something you don't know you'd missed until you hear it again. She was tidy and she was particular, and she had opinions she'd been trained not to voice, but they came out sideways. In the way she reorganized my kitchen without a word, in the look she gave the condition of my tack room, in the small sound she made when she first saw that I'd been sleeping in my coat because the blanket on the bedroll had worn through. 2 weeks in, there was a spare blanket folded at the foot of my bedroll that hadn't been there before. I didn't say anything about it. She didn't say anything about it. The thing I couldn't have told you then, and can just barely tell you now, was what it meant to have someone doing that. Not the blanket itself. The noticing. The woman who'd been driven into a canyon in the cold looking at what I didn't have and deciding to do something about it, quietly, without making a production of it, without asking for gratitude. That kind of attention is rarer than any man's wages. I spent that November doing the heavy work in the clear hours and coming back to a house that was different from the one I'd left. She stacked wood for the stove without being asked. She put up the last of the dried herbs along the kitchen wall in a way that caught more light. She talked to Drum across the fence rail on evenings. Nothing I could hear, just her voice low and him standing there with his ears turned toward her like a compass needle. She never complained about the pain she was carrying. I knew it was there. It was in the careful way she moved by week 3, and the way she'd stop sometimes in the middle of a thing and press one hand flat against her side and breathe through whatever was happening. But she didn't make ceremony of it, and I didn't make ceremony of offering help. I just made sure I was around. I'd not had a reason to be around the house before. I found more reasons. The baby came on a Thursday night in December. I'd been in the barn when I heard her call out. Not the way you'd cry out scared, just one clear note through the cold, and I came at a run. She was in the bedroom, and she was calm about it in the way she was calm about everything, not without feeling it, but not governed by it either. I sent for the widow Mallory 3 miles east, who'd midwifed half the county, and I sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with my hat in my hands and listened to the sounds of something hard happening on the other side of it. The boy came out alive. That was the thing. I didn't know I'd been braced against the alternative until I heard the baby's cry and felt the bracing let go. Mrs. Mallory came out to tell me, and she gave me a look I didn't entirely understand at the time, like she was seeing something she had an opinion about, and then she went back in. I went to the doorway. Nessa was sitting up against the headboard with the boy in her arms. She was pale and her hair was loose, and she had that particular quiet that comes after something enormous. The baby was red, and doing the thing babies do, squinting at the light of the lamp like it had done them a personal offense. She looked up at me. She said, "Come see." I went to the side of the bed, and I looked at the boy. He was small. His hands were unbelievable, the size of them, the fingers already shaped and perfect, the nails no bigger than a match head. He had dark hair, same as his mother. She held him out toward me, and I didn't think about it. I took him. He was heavier than I expected, solid in a way I hadn't thought a new thing could be, and warm. He blinked up at the lamp. Nessa was watching me. I said, "He's a good-looking boy." She said, "Yes," and then, "I'm going to call him Thomas, if that's all right." I looked at her. Why would it need to be all right with me? She said, "Because this is your house." I said, "It doesn't make it my say." She said, "Calvert." It was the first time she'd used my given name. It sat different than the Mr. had. She said, "Calvert, what are we doing here?" I looked down at Thomas, who had found my thumb and wrapped his whole hand around it. I said, "I'm not entirely sure, but I think we're doing all right." She stayed through the winter, then through the spring. I had occasion to go into Creston in February, supplies mostly, and one piece of business at the land office. It was a Thursday, and the main street had the particular frozen mud of a high plains winter, and I was coming out of the feed store when I saw the man. I knew him by description only, but I knew him. Tall, well-dressed for the cold, riding coat with the collar up, a man who moved through the world like it owed him a clear path. He looked at me and through me both at once, the way certain men look at certain other men. I went on with my business. I don't know what I'd expected to feel seeing him. Some kind of fire, maybe. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder than fire. Something more like the particular weight you feel when you've decided a thing and the decision's done. I took the supplies home. I unhitched the wagon. I fed Drum and walked to the house and went inside. She was at the table with Thomas, who was 3 months old by then and had developed opinions of his own about everything. She looked up when I came in. I said I was in Creston today. She went still. I said I didn't speak to him, I didn't intend to. I hung up my coat. I just saw him. She waited. I said I put in a question at the land office about what a man in your situation might be able to claim legally with the child, who had standing. They pointed me to a document. She was watching me carefully now. I said it's not simple, and there's the matter of Alden and the matter of his family's land. But I spoke to the attorney there, Hames. Do you know him? I know who he is. He's willing to look at it, the desertion and the circumstances. He said there might be a case if a woman had witnesses to her state and condition when she was found. I paused. I would be a witness. She looked at me for a long time. I said, "Nessa, I want to tell you something straight, and I want you to hear it straight without reading anything into it. I'm not saying. What that man did driving you out the way he did in that condition in the cold, that's not something that ought to have a consequence of nothing. That's not a right outcome." She said very quietly, "No. So if you want to pursue it." Hames says spring term. She looked down at Thomas, who had wrapped his hand in the front of her dress and gone to sleep. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Because I know what it looks like when a capable person has been told a long time they don't have a right to the help that's owed them. And I've got the years to spare and the standing in this county to back you up, and that's not nothing. She was quiet. I said, "You can tell me no." She said, "I'm not going to tell you no." The spring term was in April. It was 3 days. I testified on the first day, and I told what I'd found and where and what condition it was in. And I told it the way I tell things, short and plain, and with the names of the landmarks so nobody could doubt the place or the facts of it. The defense counsel was a man from out of county who tried twice to suggest I had an interest in the outcome, and I told him that any man within hearing distance of a person in that canyon would have done the same, and that if he was suggesting otherwise, he had a different understanding of this country than I had. Hames said I was the best witness he'd had in 8 years of practice. The judge found in Nessa's favor maintenance and the right of the child to the name and the inheritance. The man's attorneys appealed, and then withdrew the appeal 6 weeks later. She came out of the courthouse on the last day into April sunshine, and I was standing at the bottom of the steps with Thomas in my arms, and she came down to us, and she stopped 2 steps up so she was looking at me level. She said, "I don't know how to say what this is." I said, "You don't have to say it." She put her hand on the side of my face, just her palm, flat and warm against my jaw, and she looked at me the way I've thought about since, the way you think about something that surprised you with how much it meant. Like she was taking an account of a man, and the account was coming out in his favor, and she wanted him to know it. She said, "Calvert Das, you are a hard man to understand and a harder man to leave." I said I wasn't trying to be either one. She smiled, first time I'd seen a real one from her without any of the measuring in it, just the smile. Thomas made a sound and grabbed for her, and she took him and held him against her shoulder, and she didn't move from that step, and neither did I. She never did leave. Not for want of the chance. Hames found her a position in town, a bookkeeping situation for a dry goods concern, good wages. She could have taken a room, could have built a life in Creston on the settlement money and been entirely her own. She told me all this one evening in June, sitting on the porch steps in the early dark, Thomas asleep inside, the first fireflies just starting out over the pasture grass. She said, "I thought about going. I thought about it seriously." I said, "I know it." She said, "I kept coming back to the same thing." I waited. She said, "I kept thinking about the fence post. You told me once you'd been meaning to fix that post for 3 days before you finally went out to do it." That's right. That means if you'd gotten to it on the first day, or the second, you'd have been back before dark and never gone down into that canyon. I hadn't thought about that. She said, and every time I tried to build the picture of the life in Creston, the room, the job, Thomas growing up above the dry goods store, I couldn't get it to sit right. Because everything that was good in the picture came from out here, came from that post you put off 3 days. She looked out at the pasture. I said, "I'm not an easy man to be around." She said, "I know that." I said, "I go quiet for days. I'm not good at," I stopped. "I'm not good at saying what things are." She said, "I noticed." I said, "Nessa." She turned and looked at me. I said, "I would like it if you stayed." She held my gaze. She said, "I know that too, Calvert. I've known it for a while." She reached over and put her hand on mine where it rested on the step, not making a speech of it. Just putting her hand there, fingers over mine and leaving it. The fireflies moved out across the grass. Drums stamped somewhere in the dark of the corral. Inside, Thomas made the small sound he made when he was dreaming something, and then went quiet. I turned my hand over under hers. We sat there as the dark came all the way in, and the stars got bright above the canyon rim to the south. The same canyon, the same piece of dark where I'd found her, and the night didn't seem like the same night at all. It was better. It was so much better than the one before it.